The air that week was not merely dry, it was charged, electric. Each step on the lawn felt like shattering brittle glass, and the wind seemed to strip the very skin from your bones. The county had imposed a stringent Level 5 fire restriction. No open flames, no barbecues, not even a fire pit with a spark arrestor. Having served as a firefighter, I recognized this oppressive dryness, the kind that always presaged a conflagration. My orchard, a legacy passed down since the 1940s, occupied the eastern fringe of our neighborhood. My grandfather had initiated the citrus grove. My father later introduced the almond trees. I spent my youth navigating those branches, endured a few falls, and eventually showed my daughter how to gauge ripeness by hue rather than by touch. These trees were more than just vegetation. They were a living chronicle. Thus, observing the homeowners association staff dragging burn barrels and propane tanks toward our property line instilled a chilling dread in my gut. I approached them with measured steps, neither hasty nor irate, but with a deliberate, steady gait, the stride of someone accustomed to quenching flames, not igniting them. It was evident they didn't recognize me. The current HOA board was largely unfamiliar, an influx of ambitious newcomers, primarily real estate agents, an insurance claims adjuster, and a solar panel salesman obsessed with property aesthetics had taken over after last year's election. "Hello," I stated, halting just beyond the freshly laid gravel. "You're aware of the comprehensive fire ban, aren't you?" The woman in charge, clipboard in hand, turned with a slow, practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her red blouse bore an embroidered HOA emblem. "We have a maintenance exemption," she declared. "No, you don't," I replied, my tone calm yet firm. "Not for an open burn of this magnitude. I had confirmed with the county earlier that day. There are currently no exemptions for HOA landscaping that involve open burning." She blinked. "Sir, with all due respect," I presented my phone, displaying a PDF directly from the fire marshal's office, released just 10 hours prior. "I had also submitted a formal notification to your board last week, which I sent via certified mail." She declined to look, instead turning to the workers and gesturing for them to cease. "Let's pause operations here, everyone," she instructed, then addressed me again. "We will verify this and resume if permitted." I harbored no illusions about their sincerity. That evening, I dispatched another email, reattaching the notice, including time-stamped photographs, and adding the county fire marshal's office to the CC line as a precaution. The following morning, I discovered scorched earth barely 20 feet from my outermost trees, with blackened ash smudging a portion of my irrigation system. There were no calls, no apologies, not even a knock at the door. It was then I understood. This wasn't a matter of ignorance, but of unadulterated arrogance. I'd learned a crucial lesson over the years. People don't always heed warnings, they respond to consequences, and they respect authority. The HOA, in their minds, was above both. I lodged an official complaint with the county and enlisted the help of a neighbor who owned a small photography business, requesting his drone footage. He had captured the entire spectacle: gas canisters, illicit bonfires, and HOA staff reveling as if it were a casual weekend gathering. Still, the board remained silent. No responses, no acknowledgments. 3 days later, the wind shifted. If you've never experienced a Santa Ana wind, it's difficult to articulate. It's not a breeze, not even a gust. It's a palpable pressure, a force that descends from the mountains like a hammer blow, dry and sudden. That morning, the wind blew from the south carrying an unforgettable scent: burnt plastic, eucalyptus, and the distinct aroma of citrus bark. I rushed outside, barefoot. From the ridge behind my orchard, I witnessed smoke billowing, not as a plume, but as an expanding wall, followed by flames that leaped horizontally with astonishing speed, like a living entity. They surged through the unmanaged dry brush the HOA had failed to clear. I yelled for my daughter to retrieve the emergency kit. By the time I reached the back gate, the flames had already consumed the eastern fence. My attempts to douse them with the hose were futile. The water pressure was insufficient, a consequence of the HOA's mandated water conservation measures. My own land, and I was powerless to protect it. I collapsed to my knees as the first row of trees ignited. 20 years of careful pruning, composting, and meticulous frost tracking all consumed before my eyes. I'm not prone to tears, but I confess, as the first tree split in the inferno and imploded, I screamed. That cry held a depth beyond mere anger. It was a profound sense of betrayal, for I knew this devastation was entirely avoidable. They had been forewarned. I had warned them, but they chose not to listen. They never do, until it's irrevocably too late. The following day, I surveyed the scorched earth as if it were a crime scene, for to me it was. My boots crunched through what had been fertile loam, now brittle and grey like bone dust. The citrus trees nearest the fence were reduced to charred stalks, licked clean by the flames. I found a half-melted irrigation nozzle, twisted and warped as if a silent scream had been frozen in plastic. The air still reeked of scorched earth and gasoline. Then came the ultimate indignity, a notice from the HOA, a citation for improper fire barrier maintenance and failure to control combustible growth along the shared boundary, which, in their words, may have contributed to the rapid spread of a controlled HOA-permitted burn. I held the paper, staring not in disbelief. I was far beyond that, but with a rising, icy fury. They had started the fire, disregarded all warnings, violated the county's ban, and now they dared to shift the blame. I dialed the number on the notice. No answer. I emailed the board. No reply. Finally, I marched directly to the HOA office, a modular structure with a faux rock facade and tinted windows, attempting to project an image of gravitas. A young receptionist looked up, startled. "May I help you?" "I need to speak with the individual who signed this notice," I stated, placing the paper on the counter. "That would be Mr. Kevin Reels. He's in a board meeting." "Then I will wait." She hesitated, then nodded slowly. I sat and waited. When Kevin finally emerged, it took him a full minute to recognize me. "Oh, Mr. Baxter." "Yes, regarding the violation." "You sent me a violation notice," I interjected, cutting him off. "After your burn destroyed half my orchard." He straightened the clipboard he held under his arm like a makeshift shield. "It was a permitted maintenance operation." "No, it wasn't," I countered. "I have copies of the county ban, photographs, and drone footage showing your crew igniting fires during a red flag warning." "Still," he said, attempting a calm tone, "you cannot disregard your responsibility to maintain a proper fire break. Your property line was overgrown." "My property line," I stated, stepping forward, "was green, healthy, and lush. Yours was choked with dry brush that you never cleared. And your burn crossed onto my land." His gaze flickered. "We are still gathering information." I let out a bitter, sharp laugh. "No, you're trying to cover your backside." That night, I delved into the HOA's website, meticulously collecting records, meeting minutes, agenda items, and permit applications. I cross-referenced them with public county records. Nothing aligned. No permit had been issued for a controlled burn, no coordination with the fire department, no notification to residents. However, there were minutes from a closed-door meeting held 3 weeks prior discussing a vegetation management initiative. Buried within vague language, the intent was unmistakable. They had planned this, intending to clear common areas with fire, deeming it cheaper and faster than professional removal. It was reckless, illegal, and now they were attempting to scapegoat me for the inevitable consequences. That was the moment I made my decision. I contacted an old friend, Caleb, who had retired from the fire marshal's office the previous year. We had served together during a wildfire deployment in Northern California. He still had connections. I asked if he would visit, strictly as a favor, to walk the burn line with me. He agreed, bringing his camera, notepad, and his seasoned instincts. "Jesus, Sam," he muttered, crouching near a charred stump. "That's no controlled burn. That's arson, born of incompetence." "Do you think it's actionable?" I inquired. He stood and gestured towards the fence. This is encroachment, and if you can demonstrate prior notice and their refusal to comply, yeah, you've got a substantial case." I handed him the certified mail receipt and the drone images. His eyes widened. "County Fire is going to relish this." 2 days later, investigators arrived, clad in high-visibility vests, armed with spray paint. They marked ignition points, measured heat dissipation, and took statements from neighbors. The HOA attempted to intervene, claiming it was private property. It was futile. Once you've burned someone's land during a county-wide ban, it ceases to be solely private. Word spread rapidly. Some neighbors arrived to offer condolences, others whispered about past grievances, the HOA's fines against a single mother for a backyard kiddie pool, or their threats to an elderly couple over wind chimes. Minor infractions, perhaps, but they accumulated, like kindling. By week's end, I had collected affidavits from numerous neighbors, each recounting similar tales of abuse of power, stonewalling, and intimidation. Yet despite the irrefutable evidence, the prevailing burn ban, and the smoldering ruin of my orchard, the HOA board refused to admit fault. "We regret the unfortunate spread of the burn," Kevin wrote in a public statement on Nextdoor, "but believe all proper procedures were followed." I printed it out, highlighting every deliberate falsehood. Then I initiated a lawsuit, not just for damages, but for gross negligence, willful endangerment, property destruction, and violation of emergency county orders. They chose to play with fire. Now they would face its heat. The inferno reached the first row of trees just after noon. It began subtly, so subtly that without years of observing flame dynamics, one might have assumed containment was possible. A faint wisp of orange snaked through the undergrowth, a flicker ascending the base of a fig tree. Then the wind intensified, not as a breeze, but as a steady, insistent shove, as if nature itself had embraced violence. The flames surged forward, ravenous, crackling through branches with heat that preceded their actual contact with the bark. The fire crowned, leaping from treetop to treetop with a speed no hose could possibly match. I stood by the irrigation valve, my hand fixed on the cold metal as the first almond tree fractured down its center and folded like flimsy paper. I didn't hear myself cry out. I hadn't realized I'd dashed into the smoke until my daughter Ellie grasped my arm, pulling me back towards the house. "Dad, stop!" she yelled, her voice raspy from coughing. "We have to go." But the rose 7. "No," she sobbed, tears streaming, her voice choked with screams. "They're gone, Dad. They're all gone." I cast one last look back. It was true. The orchard I had dedicated half my life to cultivating, the one my father had lovingly tended before me, was collapsing row by row. I could discern the handwritten tags, Golden Bell, Crimson Heart, Starlight Citrus, all curling in the heat, vanishing into smoke. It was like watching generations disintegrate into ash. We retreated rapidly towards the shed, a structure I had painstakingly built years prior with fire-resistant siding and its own independent sprinkler system. Ironically, this small building housed more than just tools. It contained every ledger, every crop journal, every scribbled note my grandfather had jotted down in the margins of old paperbacks when inspiration struck regarding irrigation patterns. It was our true family archive. I activated the emergency system. Water cascaded across the rooftop and along the ground perimeter. For a fleeting moment, I believed it might hold. But just then, a flaming limb arced through the air like a projectile hurled by divine wrath, landing squarely on the roof. It erupted in flames instantly. Inside, I heard a crash, a muffled thud, then the sharp sound of breaking glass. Ellie shrieked. I pulled her back as the roof buckled and the shed imploded with a hiss of steam and the roar of dissolving memories. That was the moment I broke. Not in fury, but in profound grief. I sank to my knees in the gravel driveway, staring blankly. In that instant, the fire ceased to matter. Nothing mattered. I was no longer a retired firefighter, a homeowner, or a plaintiff. I was simply a son who had lost his father's orchard, a father who had promised this land would one day be his daughter's legacy. And now, nothing remained. All because a few individuals in positions of authority believed fire was a more convenient solution than compassion. The fire department finally arrived 30 minutes later. By then the blaze had consumed half the eastern ridge and was advancing toward the main street where the HOA offices stood. "Structure threat at Hilltop and Mesa Ridge," a firefighter shouted into his radio. "It's moving fast. Winds have shifted again." And then I saw it. The smoke column twisting, turning back as if possessed of its own volition. The flames, which had ravaged my orchard with relentless speed, were now leaping across the street, creeping up the meticulously manicured lawns of the HOA's model homes. They had viewed fire as a tool, but it had become something more, a reckoning. As the emergency vehicles scrambled up the road and hoses unfurled like silver serpents, I stood back and watched, not with elation, not with vengeance, but with the same hollow stillness of someone who had witnessed fire claim more than it ever gave. I could hear the pops of decorative fencing igniting, the brittle crackle of synthetic siding melting. HOA trucks parked along the curb began to smolder, then explode, one by one, fueled by the very canisters they had used in those forbidden burn barrels. Ellie stood beside me, her small hand clasped in mine. She spoke no words. Neither did I. There was nothing left to say. This wasn't justice, it was simply cause and effect. Hours later, after the flames subsided and the smoke turned from black to gray, a sheriff approached us. His face was streaked with ash, his helmet tucked under one arm. "Are you the property owner?" he asked. "Yes," I replied, my voice raspy. "We'll need a full statement. The county is bringing in state fire investigators. This is going to be significant." I nodded. Behind him, I saw Kevin Riles, the HOA president, standing amidst the ruins of what had been the board's clubhouse. His red blouse was now streaked with soot. He was on his phone, pacing frantically, gesturing wildly at everything and nothing. He caught my eye, his face a mask of fear and disbelief. He had never imagined the fire could reach him, but fire respects no titles, no power, no self-importance. It only recognizes fuel, and that day the HOA had provided an abundance of it. Back at the house, I sat on the porch, my knees stained with ash, my hands trembling. Ellie brought me a cold towel and placed it on my neck. She remained silent. Instead, she walked to the back fence, knelt in the dirt, and began to dig. "What are you doing?" I inquired. She looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "Saving a root," she said quietly. "One of the old lemon trees might have survived underground. If it did, we can bring it back." I watched her work, watched her flicker of hope, and somewhere deep within the desolation, a single thought took root once more. They took everything, but not forever. Not if we fight strategically, and not if we refuse to let them dictate the conclusion of our story. The most agonizing kind of tragedy is the one you foresee. And I had seen this coming, as clearly as headlights on a dark highway. Weeks before the blaze, I had submitted not one, but two formal complaints against the HOA. The first was a letter, certified and time-stamped, addressed to the board president, the property manager, and the neighborhood safety committee. The second was a digital submission to the county's fire prevention and safety division, complete with drone imagery, geolocation data, and weather advisories. I had exhausted every legal avenue available to me. I knew their burn plans were reckless. I had personally witnessed their landscaping crews igniting trash piles on parched ground in late summer when a single errant spark could have decimated an entire block. I had even documented instances of this, capturing cell phone videos from my second-story window, showing their so-called maintenance crew tossing a handful of matches onto overgrown brush adjacent to a retaining wall. The HOA termed it beautification. I called it a loaded firearm with no one minding the trigger. When my complaints went unacknowledged, I followed up initially with politeness, then with increasing firmness. I highlighted the fire risk in bold letters, attached satellite images, and quoted the California Fire Code. I even visited the HOA office in person to inquire why my certified letter had not received a response. The receptionist offered me that practiced smile of someone accustomed to placating disgruntled residents. "Oh, I'm sure it's in the queue," she said, tapping at her keyboard. "We've been quite busy planning the fall community cleanup, but I can leave a note for Kevin to review it." "You mean the same cleanup where he intends to use open flames on a red flag warning weekend?" Her fingers froze mid-tap. I departed without another word. I had spent years in fire safety, including stints working wildfire control lines in the Sierras. I know what negligence looks like. And this HOA board was rife with it. They weren't merely oblivious, they were dismissive. The kind of people who believed rules were for others. The sort who wore badges and carried clipboards, assuming these tokens granted them authority. So I meticulously preserved every receipt, email, photograph, and copy of each complaint. I didn't know when it would become relevant, but I knew, with certainty, that someday it would. And then the orchard burned. Suddenly, my meticulously compiled paper trail transformed into a fuse. After the fire, I transmitted the entire archive, every file, photo, and timestamp, to the county fire inspector assigned to the case. His name was Lieutenant Grant, a man of broad shoulders and no-nonsense demeanor, whose eyes conveyed a history of witnessing homes consumed like matchboxes. He met me at the edge of the orchard, his boots crunching on the blackened earth. I handed him the manila folder without uttering a word. He opened it, flipped through the pages, and raised an eyebrow. "You warned them 3 times, I stated. Once directly, twice with documentation. He nodded slowly. And they acknowledged receipt. They never responded. He extracted a paper from the folder, a screenshot of the HOA's next-door post, claiming they had followed all proper procedures. Grant let out a scoff. "They're going to regret that." Within days, the county issued a statement. The burn was unauthorized. No permits had been obtained. The HOA had failed to coordinate with the fire marshal or submit the necessary pre-burn risk assessments. Even more damaging, the fire's origin point was within the boundaries of HOA-managed common grounds, establishing full liability. The press quickly caught wind of the situation. Local news ran a segment titled, "HOA Firestorm, Did Neighborhood Board Spark Disaster?" They featured drone footage from my neighbor's camera, the same footage I had included in my complaint. The video zoomed in on 2 men in yellow vests pouring accelerants near a patch of overgrown grass directly opposite my orchard's fence line. They lit it. The fire walked away, laughing, and never looked back. The anchors then cut to a shaky clip of me standing in front of what had been my shed, the orchard behind me still smoldering. "I warned them," I said to the camera. "They ignored every warning, and now they want to pretend it was an accident." The video went viral. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years began appearing at my doorstep, bringing casseroles and pies. Some offered to help clear the stumps. Others simply stood on the porch and murmured, "This should never have happened." Not everyone, however, was sympathetic. One morning, I discovered a letter taped to my front door. "You're tearing this neighborhood apart. Let it go." No name, no return address. I kept it, of course. It was evidence. I started noticing black trucks with tinted windows and identical license plates circling my block more frequently. One of them idled across the street for a full hour one night, its lights extinguished. I wasn't easily intimidated. I was the one who ran towards the flames while everyone else fled. Consequently, I upgraded my exterior lighting, acquired an additional system of motion-activated surveillance devices, and kept my important documents within easy reach. The Homeowners Association Governing Board convened an urgent session the subsequent week exclusively for its members, with no opportunity for public input. However, I had allies who discreetly monitored the proceedings from the adjacent corridor. They informed me it was utter pandemonium. Some individuals advocated for issuing an apology, while others preferred to engage legal counsel. I overheard that Kevin appeared utterly exhausted, as if he hadn't slept for days. Shortly thereafter, a formal communication arrived from their legal representatives proposing a compensatory settlement as a gesture of goodwill in exchange for my agreement to withdraw my grievance and cease all public commentary. This offer was a mere fraction of the actual losses I had sustained. However, the monetary value was secondary to the underlying intent. They were attempting to purchase my silence. Instead, I submitted an amended legal claim, this time incorporating charges of impediment, reprisal, and acting in bad faith during negotiations. The conflagration had already devastated my fruit-bearing trees. Now I intended to expose the falsehoods that had attempted to conceal the truth. The meteorological forecast had predicted a minor atmospheric disturbance, but any resident with sufficient tenure in this area understands that such predictions are unreliable. There is no such thing as a brief atmospheric event when the Santa Ana winds begin to blow. These are not gentle summer breezes. They are intensely heated air currents descending from the desert, channeling through arid ravines, and transforming residential areas into tinderboxes. It was late afternoon, and the sky displayed that peculiar scorched golden hue that triggers an immediate sense of unease. I stood at the perimeter of what had once been my orchard, gazing upon charred remnants of rose bushes and soil reduced to ash. Ellie had been sent to stay with her aunt for a few days, seeking air that was free from the stench of smoke. I was alone. It was at this moment that I perceived a change. Initially, it was merely a rustling sound emanating from the upper branches of the withered trees above me. Then, a more forceful gust of wind began to blow, originating from the opposite direction of the fire's initial spread. I closed my eyes and began counting. 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000. Then, a sudden, powerful gust nearly stole my breath. It was happening again, precisely the same pattern I had observed years prior in the foothills near Chico. A stable burn zone had been destabilized by the late-day winds, except this time the burn zone had not been stable to begin with. It had been a heap of dry brush ignited by individuals exhibiting both a lack of permits and an even greater deficit in judgment. I turned my attention towards the Homeowners Association district situated just beyond the crest of the hill. The fire had already singed the common grounds adjacent to the bicycle path, then retreated. However, with this shift in wind direction, everything was once again a possibility. The residences within the HOA development were designed for aesthetic appeal, featuring matching roof tiles, vinyl siding, and ornamental shutters that had never fulfilled their functional purpose. Visually appealing from the exterior, but structurally unsound within. A fire entering such a community was akin to a predator discovering a henhouse. I did not contact emergency services. Instead, I telephoned Caleb. The wind had shifted, I informed him, blowing from the southeast and rapidly gaining intensity. He did not hesitate. "You believe it will cross over?" he inquired. "I don't think so," I responded. "I know." Within 20 minutes I heard the wail of sirens, but it was already too late. I ascended the ridge behind the orchard, armed with my binoculars. From this vantage point, the entire loop of the HOA development was visible. Sycamore Court, Willow Bend, Cedar Path. Smoke was already beginning to curl upwards behind the tennis courts. Somewhere in the vicinity of the clubhouse, I observed a flicker of orange, then another. The fire had returned, now advancing towards the very individuals who had inadvertently initiated it. Initially, they scattered like insects. SUVs sped out of driveways. I could discern faint shouts echoing through the canyon, one person desperately calling for a dog, another banging on a neighbor's door, and amidst this chaos was Kevin Riles. He ran along the sidewalk in his crisply pressed khaki trousers, clutching a garden hose in one hand while barking into a telephone with the other. He directed a feeble spray of water towards some hedges as flames crept down the slope behind his property. It was almost surreal. The very individual who had advised me to maintain a proper fire break was now witnessing his backyard engulfed in a wall of flame that disregarded fire codes and board regulations entirely. I should have felt a sense of triumph. I did not. I felt an emptiness. I had warned them. I had implored them. I had pursued every available legal recourse, and none of it had proven effective until the wind changed direction. The fire reached the HOA office around sunset. It was a low-lying structure adorned with solar panels, a flagpole, and a faux stone sign at the entrance proclaiming Harmony Hills Community Est 1998. I had always detested that name. There had never been any semblance of harmony here. The flames first consumed the sign, followed by the solar panels, which exploded with loud reports that reverberated like gunshots across the ridge. By the time the fire department vehicles managed to navigate through the barricades, 3 houses were completely consumed. 2 more were smoldering, and the office building was reduced to nothing more than a blackened shell. I descended the ridge as nightfall descended. Firefighting crews were present in abundance, their hoses snaking down the streets, emergency lights casting pulsating red and blue strobes across the stucco facades. I walked deliberately, my hands raised to avoid being apprehended. It was then that I saw her. Karen Mallister, the HOA treasurer, perpetually clad in that ostentatious blazer, always acting as if she were the mayor of some prestigious locale. Now she was swathed in a wool blanket, her mascara streaked down her face, seated on the curb in front of what had once been her two-story Tuscan-style residence. She looked up at me, her lips trembling. "This isn't fair," she whispered. I remained silent. What was there to say? She understood. They all understood. They had been forewarned. And now, the inevitable consequence had arrived, not in a courtroom, but in a firestorm that showed no discrimination between the culpable and the oblivious. The following morning, the sun ascended over a neighborhood still smoldering. Ash coated everything. The tennis court was a melted ruin. Playground slides had warped into useless lumps of plastic. Lawns, once meticulously trimmed to exact specifications, were now black and brittle. Reporters arrived. Drones buzzed overhead, and gradually the details began to surface. Fire marshals issued a statement. The renewed ignition had been traced back to embers reignited from the unauthorized HOA burn. No new source of ignition had been introduced. The wind had merely dispersed what the board had already set ablaze. There would be repercussions, significant ones, and I was determined to ensure they were implemented, because this was more than just a fire. It was irrefutable evidence, proof that arrogance ignites, that silence spreads like wildfire, and that sometimes justice manifests not through the pronouncements of a judge, but through a subtle shift in the wind. The subsequent morning, I returned, my boots securely laced and my fire-resistant gloves donned, though there was nothing left to battle, not for me at least. My orchard was a charcoal graveyard, yet as I crested the ridge and surveyed the HOA development below, I witnessed something I had never anticipated. Their meticulously constructed world of uniformity, stucco, and smug self-importance had vanished. Completely gone. What had once been immaculate cul-de-sacs lined with identical cookie-cutter, Tuscan-inspired homes now resembled a war-torn landscape. Not a single roof remained intact. Driveways were strewn with the burnt-out husks of SUVs. Mailboxes stood like somber gravestones. The faux cobblestone welcome sign lay face down in the gutter, partially melted, bearing only the inscription. Irony possesses a cruel sense of humor. The fire had swept through that area with remarkable speed and showed no impartiality. It claimed the residences of both board members and passive observers alike. And now, ash blanketed everything. Lawns, fences, ceramic garden gnomes, all muted in the same somber shade of gray. I identified Kevin's house first. It had been the focal point of the HOA's pride, cream-colored stucco, a Spanish tile roof, and a 6-foot ornamental fountain in the yard that had never functioned correctly, but exuded an air of expense. The fountain was now a contorted mass of concrete and iron, and the front windows had exploded outward from the intense heat. From inside, I could see through the entire structure. No ceilings remained, no furniture, just the blackened skeletal remains of what had been a $750,000 executive property. He was there as well, seated on the curb, with a clipboard resting on his lap, as if that would still prove useful. A dazed expression was etched on his face. He seemed neither angry nor frightened, merely hollow. He looked up and noticed me. For once he remained silent. I, too, offered no words. What was there to say? He had already read the fire report. He understood precisely what had caused the inferno. And more critically, he knew that I had attempted to avert it. I could discern this in his averted gaze, like a man confronting a spectral presence that was undeniably alive. I proceeded past him without altering my pace. The fire had not merely annihilated structures, it had shattered the illusion of control that the HOA had meticulously constructed, brick by brick. That illusion had governed our lives, dictating the color of our fences, the height of our grass, even the permissible number of vehicles in our own driveways. And now it had, quite literally, transformed into smoke. I made my way towards the community clubhouse, the supposed epicenter of Harmony Hills. That building had served as their stronghold, the site where decisions were made behind closed doors, complaints were disregarded, neighbors were shamed, and violations were extinguished like smoldering embers. It was gone. The structural frame had collapsed inwards. The HVAC unit lay on the sidewalk, toppled like a monument to squandered resources. On the lawn, I recognized the melted frame of the Homeowner of the Year plaque, its brass inscription distorted by the heat. There was a certain poetic irony to the scene, and then I heard voices. Within the charred shell of what had been the meeting hall, a group of HOA staff members were sifting through scorched file boxes, perhaps attempting to salvage documents or, more likely, to conceal their involvement. I stepped inside, my shoes crunching on shattered glass. Karen turned around abruptly, startled. Her blazer, once a vibrant cherry red and impeccably tailored, was now torn and flecked with soot. She appeared utterly exhausted, her eyes red-rimmed, mascara trailing like dark veins. Upon seeing me, she straightened and attempted a smile. I did not reciprocate. "I suppose you're enjoying this," she remarked, her voice strained. "No," I replied. "I would have preferred if you had listened the first time." She flinched as if struck. "We never intended for this to happen," she mumbled. I moved past her and gazed down at one of the filing cabinets. Its drawers hung open, revealing charred folders dangling like protruding tongues. "Everything smelled of damp smoke and scorched ink," I stated calmly. "You intended to cut corners," I clarified. "You aimed for expediency, brevity, and silence, and now," I looked back at her, "you've incinerated your own kingdom." That afternoon, the county announced a formal inquiry into the conduct of the HOA board, not solely concerning the unauthorized burn, but also regarding the mismanagement of funds, falsification of records, and obstruction of community safety protocols. It transpired that the maintenance project had been sanctioned in a closed session without a public vote, a direct contravention of the Open Meetings Act. Furthermore, the funds allocated to the landscaping company had not undergone the standard bidding process. The company, it emerged, was purportedly owned by the cousin of one of the board members. It was a textbook case of negligence masked by bureaucratic jargon, and it was rapidly unraveling. The insurance providers declined to issue payouts, especially with the potential for arson-adjacent liability. FEMA offered assistance, but it was limited, as the HOA had disregarded state emergency directives, rendering them ineligible for comprehensive disaster relief. Homeowners were incensed, not merely by the fire itself, but by the years of manipulation they had failed to recognize until this point. Petitions circulated, demanding resignations. Some residents initiated independent legal actions. Others simply relocated, their homes destroyed, their peace of mind consumed, along with their properties. As for myself, I returned to my land, to the orchard that was no more, and I commenced digging. Not merely for roots or hope or emotional release. I began to dig because fire does not have the final say. Not here, not with me. Initially, I had presumed the fire would mark the conclusion of events, the climax, the catastrophe that would finally bring everything to light. However, it transpired that the fire was merely the catalyst, and the true upheaval was bureaucratic. When the county fire marshal's office submitted its preliminary report to the district attorney, it initiated a cascade of revelations. What commenced as a civil liability investigation into illegal burning rapidly evolved into something more extensive, more reprehensible, and far more systemic. It began with the permits, or rather the distinct lack thereof. No one could locate a single valid burn permit filed by the HOA for the month in which the fire commenced. Kevin Reels had adamantly insisted for weeks that all authorizations were in order, even posting a notice on the HOA website claiming they possessed verbal approval from a county inspector. This inspector, when interviewed, burst into laughter. "I've never spoken to anyone from Harmony Hills," he stated for the record. "And even if I had, verbal authorization is non-existent during a red flag warning. That's basic firefighting knowledge." However, the conclusive evidence, quite literally smoking, emerged from a whistleblower. A young man named Jordan Lee, who had briefly been employed by the landscaping company contracted by the HOA, came forward with an audio recording. In it, Kevin's voice is unmistakably clear, calm, collected, and damning. "Now, we don't need to wait for the paperwork. The county dawdles. By the time we get approval, we'll miss the cleanup window. Just do it before someone complains. If anyone asks, say we had it cleared." That audio clip was broadcast on the 6 o'clock news within 24 hours. Suddenly, this transcended mere negligence. It was outright fraud, a willful violation of public safety statutes. And under California Penal Code 452, recklessly setting fire to another person's property can be classified as a felony. They had not only destroyed my orchard, they may have committed a criminal offense. From that point forward, everything began to unravel. The county subpoenaed HOA meeting minutes from the preceding 2 years. Half were missing. The remaining half exhibited alterations, deletions, and entire redacted paragraphs without any justification. It became apparent that many of the closed-door sessions the board had conducted were not legally permissible. California's Davis-Sterling Act mandates that homeowner associations must provide notification to residents and grant access to board discussions unless specific exceptions apply, none of which were relevant in this instance. Subsequently, a financial audit was initiated. Apparently, the board had diverted emergency funds earmarked for stormwater system repairs towards a landscaping beautification initiative without any disclosure, without any votes, and without any coherent receipts. A contractor identified as Greenland Resources LLC had received $97,000 over a 6-month period. However, Greenland Resources LLC did not exist in the Secretary of State's database. It was a shell company registered under the name Trevor Reels, Kevin's younger brother. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. They had been funneling HOA dues into companies owned by family members, cutting corners, and utilizing fire as a cleanup mechanism while cloaking it in euphemisms such as vegetation thinning. When I received the call from the county prosecutor's office, I was standing in my field, shovel in hand, digging around the single surviving lemon tree. "Mr. Baxter," the investigator stated, "we would like to formally inquire if you would be willing to testify once charges are filed." I did not hesitate. I agreed gladly. I was not seeking retribution, but I was finished allowing these individuals to bury their falsehoods beneath layers of policy language and disingenuous smiles. They had operated like a cartel, with lanyards, hiding behind bylaws, weaponizing compliance notices, and shaming homeowners who dared to question them. And now they were finally going to be held accountable. The court date was scheduled for November. In the interim, news outlets continued their investigations. A local journalist, who had previously penned superficial articles about HOA community engagement, published an exposé detailing 3 other instances where the board had allegedly coerced homeowners into silence. One couple was fined $4,000 for repainting their door without prior approval, only to discover later that Karen Mallister had unilaterally altered the paint palette guidelines without a vote simply to ensure their home did not clash with hers. Another resident, a 72-year-old veteran, had been subjected to harassment for the unauthorized installation of a flagpole on Memorial Day. All of this was coming to light now, and public sentiment was one of anger. The same residents who had previously averted their gaze when I spoke out were now appearing at my doorstep with signed petitions. They desired the dissolution of the HOA, new bylaws, and the return of control to the individuals who actually resided in the homes, not those who sought to exploit them. At the subsequent emergency community gathering, held in a borrowed church gymnasium because the HOA office remained a burnt-out shell, more than 300 residents were in attendance. Kevin was absent, as was Karen. Instead, their legal representatives read prepared statements expressing profound regret and citing unforeseen circumstances, while most of the attendees maintained stony expressions. Then, someone passed me the microphone. I had not intended to speak, but as I surveyed the crowd, faces of individuals I'd lived alongside for years, people who had once avoided my gaze in the grocery store, I realized they were finally prepared to listen. So, I recounted the story of the orchard, of the warnings, of the imposed silence. I did not wish for conflict, I stated. I simply desired to cultivate fruit on land my family had planted before my birth. I adhered to the regulations. I submitted the complaints. I sounded every alarm I could find, and you ignored them. You gambled with all of our lives, mine, yours, your children's, and you lost. A profound hush fell over the assembly. Then someone stood and began to clap. Another joined in, and suddenly the gymnasium was filled with a sound I had not heard in months: support. For the first time, I did not feel like a solitary voice crying out in the wilderness. I felt like a man standing alongside a community that had finally awakened. The motion to remove the board passed with 97% approval, and the fire, it ceased to be merely a disaster. It became a turning point. The first time I handled a fire hose, I was 19 years old, trembling in a smoke-choked canyon north of Bakersfield, utterly terrified, yet feigning composure. We stood shoulder to shoulder on a hillside, illuminated by an orange glow from the flames, breathing through damp rags and carving fire breaks with hands blistered to the raw flesh. That was the day I grasped two fundamental truths. Fire moves faster than fear, and the only element that impedes its progress is an individual willing to stand their ground. I never imagined I would need to recall that lesson in a suburban neighborhood. Yet, here I was again. This time, not in uniform, not as part of a crew, but as a man with a ruined orchard and an ash-covered landscape surrounding him, confronting a new form of fiery chaos. The day following the vote to dissolve the HOA board, I began to receive knocks at my door. They were not angry encounters, nor were they threats. These were neighbors. Genuine neighbors, approaching with questions, their hair still bearing traces of soot and their voices laced with anxiety. Do you know how to check our attics for embers? Should I be concerned about my gas line? Can you teach me how to operate this fire extinguisher? And the most significant question of all, can you help us build something better? They did not seek me as a leader. They desired me to impart knowledge, and that was something I could do. So I obliged. We started on a modest scale. I printed wildfire preparedness guides from CAL FIRE's website and organized an informal meeting on my lawn, utilizing a whiteboard salvaged from the scorched remnants of the community center. Initially, there were only 6 participants, then 12, and subsequently 30. I instructed them on establishing defensible space, identifying ember traps around vents and wooden fences, clearing brush without creating combustible piles, and truly understanding a wind map rather than relying solely on the emoji-laden forecasts on their phones. Word spread, and the neighborhood underwent a transformation, not dictated by top-down directives, but cultivated through grassroots knowledge. Individuals who once exchanged hostile glances over the precise height of their lawns were now sharing shovels and hauling dirt. Teenagers assisted their elderly neighbors in clearing gutters. Fathers transformed barbecue gatherings into mulch-spreading parties. They did not merely clean up, they matured, all without the issuance of a single compliance letter. Meanwhile, the former board members maintained a conspicuous silence. Kevin had gone completely incommunicado. Rumor had it that his residence was uninsured due to issues with fraudulent permit applications, and he had retained legal counsel. Karen had moved in with her sister on the other side of town. She filed a countersuit for emotional distress after residents bombarded her with irate voicemails, but it was dismissed within weeks. I did not take any pleasure in their misfortunes. I was too preoccupied with my work. One morning I received a call from the fire marshal himself, Lieutenant Grant. "Sam," he said, "we've been observing the developments over there." Observing how the community was actively involved in restoration and preparation, I was prompted to consider a more formal approach. I chuckled, explaining I was retired. He countered, "What about a temporary return to the workforce? We're establishing a regional program focused on fire preparedness. We need volunteers, instructors, individuals who truly understand the risks, and you clearly fit that description." This led to me finding myself in front of a class at the local community college, leading a workshop titled "Neighborhoods That Resist Fire, Preparedness in a Dry Climate." Ellie accompanied me on that initial day, seated prominently in the front row, arms crossed, feigning disinterest. However, I noticed her subtle smile when a participant inquired about my extensive knowledge, to which I replied, "Because I once witnessed fire consume everything dear to me." My efforts weren't confined to teaching. I also continued working the land. Gradually, and with considerable effort, I began replanting the orchard. It wasn't an immediate undertaking. I lacked both the financial resources and the stamina. Instead, row by row, Ellie assisted me whenever her schedule permitted. We planted young trees where the old ones had been incinerated. I maintained the original layout: almonds to the west, citrus in the center. But this time, I incorporated a pedestrian walkway along the perimeter for visitors. People began arriving, not just neighbors, but also media representatives, students, and even urban planners, all eager to learn how we had transformed a disastrous homeowners association situation into a model of community resilience. Someone even playfully suggested charging an entrance fee. I politely declined, stating, "No, this orchard was never intended for profit. It was for healing." However, I welcomed contributions such as bags of compost, borrowed tools, and even homemade lemonade from the local widow. Each gesture represented a seed of kindness. One afternoon, I discovered a handwritten note on my porch with no sender's name. It read, "I was part of the board. I voted to proceed with the burn. I remained silent. I regret it every single day. But witnessing your recovery gives me hope. Thank you." I carefully folded the note and tucked it into my work jeans. Fire, while destructive, also has a way of revealing underlying truths. It strips away pretenses, egos, and artificial facades. What remains, if one is fortunate, is authenticity. The truth is that genuine community isn't forged through regulations or official titles, but through shared hardships, collective effort, and a willingness to admit mistakes and commit to improvement. Surveying the formerly scorched landscape, now interspersed with nascent green shoots and orange markers indicating future saplings, I no longer saw devastation. I saw resilience, and I sensed that this time people were truly listening. The courthouse presented a modest facade, a simple sandstone structure in the county seat, adorned with weathered flags and creaky doors. Yet, on the morning of the hearing, the atmosphere felt charged with a palpable shift in importance. News vehicles lined the street, and a throng gathered outside, holding placards demanding justice for the orchard, no more HOA deceptions, and end arson by policy. Inside, the scene was even more extraordinary. I had previous courtroom experience, having testified in arson investigations during my firefighting career, but I had never been in the position of the plaintiff, the one who had lost everything. The seats behind me filled rapidly with neighbors, journalists, and former HOA members who had either resigned or been ousted. Some sported bandages from cleanup efforts. Others wore oxygen tubes, still recovering from smoke inhalation. They had all assembled, not for my sake specifically, but because they were weary of being silenced. Seated at the front was Kevin Reels, flanked by two attorneys whose suits likely exceeded the cost of his mortgage. He appeared diminished, not physically, but in bearing. The man who once commanded authority at HOA meetings now slumped, pale, and shrinking under the courtroom lights. Karen occupied a seat 2 rows back. Her legal counsel had attempted to separate her case, citing procedural irregularities, but the judge had denied the motion, requiring her to stand trial with the others. When the bailiff announced the case, Samuel Baxter versus Harmony Hills Homeowners Association, a hushed, almost electric silence descended upon the room. My attorney, Lacey T.R., rose with composed efficiency. She was half my age, 3 times as astute, and possessed an unwavering attention to detail. A former environmental prosecutor who had transitioned to private litigation, she had agreed to represent me pro bono after reading about the case in the local paper. "This is not merely about a fire," she stated in her opening remarks. "It is about an abuse of power, about individuals entrusted with the safety of their community who prioritize personal ego over their duties. It concerns a man who meticulously followed all protocols, issued warnings, adhered to the law, and lost everything because a group believed themselves to be exempt. And it is about ensuring such an event never recurs." She allowed the weight of her words to settle before continuing. The defense attempted to deflect blame, attributing the fire to unpredictable wind patterns and miscommunication among contractors. They asserted that Kevin had acted in good faith and that the HOA, being a volunteer organization, lacked the specialized knowledge for wildfire mitigation. Their critical misstep occurred when they placed Kevin on the witness stand. Lacey remained unperturbed. She presented the audio recording, Jordan's clip of Kevin instructing landscapers to proceed before any complaints arose. His voice, smug and self-assured, crackled from the courtroom speakers. She then displayed the burn ban order from the county website, a PDF clearly dated and time-stamped 2 days prior to the fire. This was followed by my certified warning letter, the email correspondence, drone imagery, and the HOA's own meeting minutes, albeit redacted and with missing timestamps. Methodically, she constructed the case, akin to a controlled backburn, leaving no aspect untouched. When it was my turn to testify, I spoke directly, without prepared notes. I recounted the story of the orchard, of my father's hands tending the initial trees, of the fragrant lemon blossoms in spring, and of the night I watched the inferno engulf it all. But I also shared the aftermath. The neighbors who arrived with shovels, the children who helped transport mulch, and the new walking path lined with saplings planted by hands once paralyzed by fear of fire. This was not solely about me, I stated, my voice raspy. It was about all of us, about what transpires when individuals in positions of authority forget that their role is to protect, not to dominate, and about the potential that emerges when we collectively declare enough. A profound silence enveloped the courtroom as I concluded my testimony. Even the judge remained speechless. Karen testified briefly. Her attorney attempted to guide her towards an expression of remorse, but she faltered. Under cross-examination, she confessed to approving budget transfers without homeowner notification and to receiving my complaint, but choosing not to escalate it because she wished to avoid dealing with Sam. That statement resonated deeply. Didn't want to deal with Sam. It implied my orchard, my land, and my warnings were merely an inconvenience, a trivial matter, easier to disregard than to address. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before delivering their verdict. Liable on all counts: gross negligence, breach of fiduciary duty, unauthorized actions during an emergency order, and destruction of private property. Kevin and Karen were held personally accountable in the judgment. The HOA, now defunct, was ordered to pay damages from its depleted reserve fund and liability insurance. However, the financial penalties were less significant than the imposed mandate. Harmony Hills HOA was to be permanently dissolved, its assets redistributed, its enforcement powers nullified, and its former members permanently barred from participating in any future district governance. As the judge pronounced the decision, Kevin remained motionless. Karen began to weep. Outside, the crowd erupted, not in outright jubilation, but in collective relief. Cheers mingled with embraces, while others simply stood, gazing at the courthouse steps as if a dam had finally broken. Reporters swarmed, but I offered no comment. Instead, I walked home. I crossed the fire-ravaged cul-de-sac, past the twisted lampposts, and turned left where the maple trees once stood. As I approached my property, I observed a child, approximately 8 years old, kneeling beside the new saplings that Ellie and I had planted. She carefully poured water from a small tin watering can, seemingly oblivious to my presence. I refrained from interrupting, recognizing that this was not an ending, but a commencement. The fire had stripped away the board's illusions, but what had emerged from the ashes belonged to us all. Spring arrived late that year. The rains were hesitant and tentative until March, as if the very sky was uncertain about its safe return. But when they finally descended, they were steady, nourishing the scorched earth, softening the lingering scars, and coaxing the earliest hints of green from soil that had once been naught but ash. One morning, as the clouds parted with a sigh of release, I walked along the new path bordering the orchard and heard a sound absent for months. Birdsong. It was not an isolated chirp, but a symphony. Warblers, mockingbirds, and even a blue jay perched atop a young lemon tree, seemed to call out to me as if to declare, "We're back, old man. You're not alone anymore." A smile touched my lips. The saplings were growing slowly but steadily. Ellie had meticulously labeled each one with hand-painted tags. Hope, persistence, and Ellie's favorite, Granddad's Corner. My personal favorite, a golden bellgraft that we had doubted would survive, stood near the orchard center. Against all odds, that delicate stem had endured frost, rain, and trauma, its leaves now shimmering as if untouched by fire. The community itself had undergone a transformation. With the HOA dissolved, something unexpected and beautiful began to flourish. It wasn't the chaos the former board had predicted, nor was it lawlessness. It was genuine connection. Neighbors formed a volunteer council, not for the purpose of control, but for coordination. There were no binding agreements, no enforced dictates, merely individuals keeping each other informed. They organized garden exchanges, neighborhood watches, and tree planting Saturdays. Ellie initiated a composting collective. Children, pedaling bicycles with buckets, collected debris and returned with soil for gardens they had never previously encountered. Mr. Lang, residing 3 houses away, constructed a seedling shelter in his garage. Prior to the fire, our interactions had been limited to fewer than 10 words. Now we exchanged recipes over the fence. The plot where the HOA office once stood was cleared in April. The community collectively decided to transform it into a public grove, a space for remembrance. Not a park, not a playground, but a tranquil area with benches, native flora, and a modest plaque proclaiming, "From the fire, we grew back stronger." This was Ellie's concept. She read the inscription aloud at the dedication ceremony, standing tall in a sun hat, her eyes glistening with tears. I remained silent that day. It was unnecessary. My hands, covered in soil and sap, communicated more eloquently than any speech could. Kevin and Karen were gone. Kevin relocated out of state. His whereabouts remain unknown. Karen attempted to rebuild her life in a different neighborhood, but the published articles, court records, and her own name proved inescapable. The last I heard, she had declared bankruptcy. I felt no elation in this news. I simply accepted it, having found my own peace. True peace, I've realized, is not secured by assigning blame. It is cultivated. The orchard had ceased to be solely mine. That was the most surprising outcome. Children helped water the trees, retirees volunteered for weeding the pathways, and a lending library was established in the old tool shed. A retired teacher offered outdoor reading instruction to children who had fallen behind during the period of disruption. That autumn, we even hosted our inaugural neighborhood harvest festival. It was an unpretentious affair, lacking sponsors or HOA-sanctioned catering. It consisted of pies, folding chairs, hay bales, music, and laughter. I sat beneath the first tree to bear fruit again, a lemon in my hand, reflecting on the myriad ways life had attempted to extinguish me. But the essence of fire lies not only in its destructive power, it is also a revealer. It exposes what is decayed, what is vulnerable, and what was never built to endure. And in its wake, it clears the ground for what comes next. Genuine community, authentic responsibility, and deep-seated roots. Challenging days still arise. Rain continues to fall. The scars persist on the trees, in the soil, and within me. However, they no longer inflict pain as they once did. They do not define the orchard. They are now an integral part of its narrative. Occasionally, individuals inquire if I am proud of my actions filing lawsuits, going public, refusing to yield. The truth is, I am not proud. I am profoundly grateful. Grateful to have lived to witness the land's recovery. Grateful that my daughter observed the significance of standing firm and the meaning of regrowth. And most of all, grateful that justice was achieved not through retribution, but through resilience, tranquility, and community. For in the end, we did more than simply reconstruct what had been lost to the flames. We forged something superior.